Under the weary hush of the late afternoon, the land stretched endless and quiet, as though it held its breath for something unnamed. The horizon shimmered with heat, dust rising in pale ghosts that drifted across the plains, and the small settlement slept in its stillness. One saloon, a narrow store, a sheriff's office, a scatter of houses pressed against the wide expanse of grass and rock. It was not a place that welcomed strangers, not a place that softened for stories carved with scars, yet fate has a way of carrying certain souls back to the very gates they once knew. Into this silence walked a woman with eyes dark as midnight rivers, steps slow yet unyielding, each one carrying the weight of hunger, of storms endured alone. Her dress clung to her frame, torn and weathered, carrying the dried shadow of old wounds. She looked as if the desert had tried to break her and failed. For anyone watching from the cracked windows of the saloon or the dusty porch rails, she was only an outsider, an Apache woman who reminded them of old feuds and forgotten fears. But within her chest burned a memory warmer than their suspicion, a memory of bread once shared beside a creek, of laughter exchanged between two children who had not yet learned the world's cruelty. That memory, tucked inside her like a secret flame, guided her steps now, even as her ribs ached and her throat burned with thirst. To turn back meant death in the wilderness. To go forward meant danger. Yet forward she went, as though drawn by something greater than her own will, something healing and undeniable. The yard came into sight, a crooked corral, patched with mismatched boards, the quiet shape of cattle beyond, the rhythm of a hammer striking wood. Her heart stumbled against her ribs as recognition bloomed. She knew this place, knew the sound of labor measured by patience, knew the air that once held laughter instead of silence. She slowed, as if time itself thickened around her. And at the gate her gaze lifted to the man who had been only a ghost in her thoughts until now. Elias Carver. Weathered, broad-shouldered, his shirt stained with dust and sweat, the lines of his face cut deeper by loss than by age. He paused, hammer in one hand, nail clenched between his teeth, his body stiffening the moment he noticed her standing there. For a heartbeat, suspicion darkened his eyes. She saw it, felt it like a blow, and fear pressed sharp against her breath. If he turned away, she had nowhere else to go. But when the light shifted, when her face lifted into his sight fully, recognition struck him like the sudden crack of thunder across a dry sky. His jaw tightened, his hand faltered, and in his silence was the echo of years they had both tried to bury. She steadied her trembling voice, drew the words from the marrow of her being, and spoke with quiet certainty. "Don't you recognize me, Cowboy? I'm your childhood love." The words carried across the dust-laden air, fragile yet fierce, and something in them unsettled the walls he had built around his heart. He could have denied it. He could have turned his back and let the settlement's harsh judgment consume her. Instead, he pulled the nail from his teeth, laid aside the hammer, and crossed to the gate. No grand welcome, no promises, only the gesture of a man who once knew the taste of innocence beside her. He pushed the gate open, stepped aside, and with a steady, quiet voice said, "Sit." And in that single word was the beginning of a story neither had expected to write again. She lowered herself onto the stoop, her knees trembling with relief, and for the first time in weeks the heaviness of fear loosened its grip. He brought her water, clear and cool, and as she drank, life flickered back into her, gentle and healing as a warm hand against an old wound. The air between them carried no certainty, only silence, heavy with memory. Yet in that silence, seeds of trust lay hidden, waiting. For the settlers who might soon whisper, for the sheriff who might ride with questions, for the dangers that always followed scars like hers, none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that the boy by the creek and the girl with wild braids were standing again on the same ground, grown now, changed by pain, yet bound by something time had not erased. Outside, the dust drifted in restless currents, the sky stretching wide as though to bear witness. Inside the man's plain home, where loneliness had once reigned, she tasted cornbread and beans offered without words, and stitched her wounds by the dim light of his lamp, while he held the flame steady in silence. It was not love yet, not forgiveness, but it was enough. A fragile shelter against the weight of the world. And though they did not know it, every choice from that moment forward would weave them closer, thread by thread, until the story became not one of survival alone, but of healing, belonging, and the quiet rebirth of love. And if you feel the warmth of this story touching your heart, if in these words you find a little healing light for your own days, I invite you to let that feeling breathe. A simple like, a kind comment, or a gentle subscription is more than just a click. It is the way you share in this journey, the way you say that such stories matter. Even the smallest gesture carries a power beyond measure, and it helps me continue weaving tales that heal, inspire, and remind us all that love, even after storms, can always return. The night settled quiet around them, but neither Elias nor Nieli reached for the door. They remained in that silence, strangers no longer, not yet lovers, but bound by something that refused to die. And so the story did not end here. It had only begun, carrying them toward trials, storms, and choices that would carve their path together. Elias remained standing a few paces away from her, the hammer still in his hand, though now it hung without purpose. He studied her face as if he could find the truth hidden in her eyes, some proof that the girl he had once known by the creek had truly returned. The years had carved lines into both of them, loss, hunger, silence, but behind the sharpness of survival, he saw the same flame he remembered from childhood, that wild spark that had once dared to laugh in the open air. Nieli, though worn thin and wounded, carried herself with the same quiet pride she had never abandoned, and the weight of his hesitation pressed on him harder than the desert heat. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, beans simmered down to a paste, and a loneliness that seemed to echo against every board. He gestured toward the chair at the table, the gesture plain, stripped of sentiment, but in its simplicity lay something rare: acceptance. She sat slowly, her ribs pulling at the torn fabric, her body weary, yet she did not let her gaze fall. She watched him instead, the way his shoulders moved, the way his hands lingered against the edge of the table, as though bracing himself for a past he had not expected to face again. The first words passed between them not as strangers, but as survivors. He asked where she had come from, and she told him in a voice steady but heavy with exhaustion. Weeks of walking, hiding, running from soldiers, clinging to life with roots, cactus fruit, and water pulled from stony creeks. Her words were plain, without embellishment, but every syllable held the rhythm of resilience, the quiet healing of someone who had refused to be erased. Elias listened, guilt simmering beneath his silence, remembering the day her people had been scattered, remembering how he had stayed quiet while she was driven into shadows. When she reached for the needle and thread she had carried all this way, pulling fabric aside to stitch her wound by her own hand, Elias's breath caught. He held the lamp closer, the warm light trembling against the raw curve of her ribs, and he told her softly, "Take it slow." No pity, no command, just the tone of a man who refused to turn his back this time. She did not falter. Her jaw clenched, her brow damp with sweat, yet her hands moved with fierce determination until the wound was closed. When it was done, she drank the willow bark tea he placed before her, a faint nod of thanks passing between them, healing in its own quiet way. That night, he gave her the bed and took the chair, his body restless in the shadows, his eyes tracing the beams above him. He thought of the boy he once was, of her laughter in the summer air, and of the woman now lying within his home, scarred but unbroken. He had lived years turning away, closing gates, avoiding weight that was not his own, yet with her, turning away felt like betrayal. He could hear her shallow breaths as she shifted against the pain, and each sound carried into his chest like a vow not yet spoken. At dawn she rose before him, sweeping the floor with a bundle of dry weeds, moving as if to prove she was no burden. The beans reheated on the stove filled the small room with their simple scent, and Elias, stepping back inside with his coffee cooling in his hand, paused at the sight. The house no longer looked abandoned. It held life again, fragile but steady. She looked up at him, and though she did not speak, her presence seemed to whisper, "I will not be cast aside." By noon, the whispers of town had already begun. A boy at the fence, eyes wide and curious, sprinting away with news, men leaning against the saloon rail, pointing toward the carver place with smoke curling from their lips. And finally the sheriff, his voice steady but edged with warning, reminding Elias of the eyes that would follow, of the danger that would grow. Elias listened, his jaw set, and when Nieli offered to leave, her words low and quiet, he shook his head with a firmness that needed no explanation. "You're not leaving." That choice, spoken plain, shifted the air between them. Nieli stood straighter despite her ribs aching, her spirit steadier for knowing she was not cast back into the wilderness. That evening she sat on the stoop in the fading light, her shoulders tired, her eyes carrying the long road behind her, and Elias set a warm cloth to her side when the pain woke her. She accepted it without words, but the glance she gave him carried something deeper than gratitude. A fragile trust, mending like the wound she had stitched beneath his lamp, a trust that promised to grow stronger if given the chance. As the wind swept across the flats that night, rattling the corral gate and stirring the dust, the two of them remained within those plain walls, each carrying doubts, each weighed down by memory, yet both unwilling to reach for the door. Survival had brought them together, but something more was beginning to root itself in the silence between them. It was not yet spoken, not yet named, but it pulsed quietly like the steady beat of a heart healing after long years of solitude. And as the pale sky broke again with the promise of another day, their story edged forward, not toward an end, but toward the trials, storms, and unspoken choices that would bind them closer with every breath. Morning settled like a soft hand on the edge of the plains, tender and pale, as if the sky itself wished for everything to mend. Nearly tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and stepped into the yard while Elias checked the gate latch, the two of them moving with the unspoken rhythm of people who had decided, if only for now, to shoulder the same day. She felt the ache at her ribs, a deep pull that reminded her of the road behind, yet she refused to bow to it. She tested the earth with her feet and breathed the cool, waking air that smelled faintly of iron and dust and something clean, like the faint promise of rain, even when the clouds held back. Elias watched her without staring, noting each careful motion, the way she placed her weight, the steady way she held pain close without letting it rule her. He admired that, though he did not say so. Instead, he picked up the coil of wire and handed her the hammer. It was an ordinary exchange, but ordinary things can feel like healing when life has been hard. They walked the northern fence line, where wind had pushed the posts crooked and last season's cattle had leaned their broad, heavy heads against weak joints. The brush sighed with the breeze. A blackbird lifted from the thorn with a surprised flutter and darted into the blue. Elias dug post holes with measured strength, not hurrying, not pausing, his muscles remembering work the way a heart remembers a pulse. Nayeli steadied the posts and held the wire taut, the hammer's handle smooth and warm in her hand. She said little, and neither did he. Still, a gentleness moved between them. Trust shaped not by words, but by work. When the wire slipped once and nicked her knuckle, she hissed softly and adjusted her grip before he could reach to take the tool from her. He let her keep it. Respect, he thought. That was the first root of anything worth growing. By midday the sun had risen warm and relentless. Sweat traced small paths through dust on their skin, and the air seemed to lean heavy over their shoulders. Elias wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and glanced toward the house, where the stovepipe rose quiet and grey. "We'll take water," he said simply. Nearly nodded, tying the loosened wrap more firmly around her ribs. They sat on the stoop and drank slow, careful swallows that felt like forgiveness in the throat. She closed her eyes for a moment and let her breath move evenly, teaching her body again that it was safe to rest. He watched her and felt some tightness coil and then loosen in his chest. The old knot of a man who had lived through too many losses loosening, just a little, because someone alive and brave was sitting at his side. She cooked that afternoon, though she did not ask. She simply rose and took to the stove, as if she were opening a door and stepping into a room she recognized. Beans thickened in their iron pot, and she shaved thin curls from a heel of salt pork and folded them through cornmeal batter until the smell of browning cornbread warmed the small house with something like shelter. Elias sat at the table and mended a strap on his saddle, all and sinew moving sure and slow. He listened to the quiet music of the room, the stir of a spoon, the faint bubble from the pot, the whisper of her breath when she leaned to check the skillet. The house, which had so long been an echo chamber for solitude, now felt layered and alive, as if another heartbeat had joined his own. They ate without hurry. She served him first, out of habit or respect, he wasn't sure. He nodded his thanks. The food steadied him the way a hand steadies a trembling shoulder. "Herbs," he said, tasting the brightness folded into the beans. She gave the smallest smile, the shape of it almost shy. "Sage from the flats," she answered. "We dry it when we can." He held the spoon above the bowl and thought of the word "we," a simple sound with a long horizon. He did not remark on it, but he carried it like a new small flame into his chest. After they washed the dishes, she stepped outside and stood on the hard-packed earth, measuring the yard with her eyes, where the wind drove dust under the door, where the fence leaned, where water pooled when the rare sky broke open. She walked the perimeter as if learning a language, and the land, stubborn as it was, seemed to yield its grammar to her patient feet. Elias joined her at the back quarter, where the soil, dark with silt, kept a secret promise of growth. "If a windbreak ran here," he said, pointing with the handle of his shovel, "it might hold enough moisture for corn come spring." She crouched, tracing a faint line with her finger. "Brush set low," she murmured, "to keep the sand from running under." He nodded, his gaze on her hands. The moment hung light and sure, the first outline of a shared future sketched in dirt. The sky shifted in the later afternoon, wind arriving in long breaths that combed the grass and rattled the tin on the shed. Elias glanced at the horizon and felt the old, quiet alertness kindle in his spine. Dust storm, maybe. The kind that fills a man's mouth with grit and sends cattle blind and breaking fences. "We'll ready the place," he said, and she answered, "Tell me where." He explained in few words, and together they moved, covering the troughs with cloth and tying them true, checking the windmill bolts, bracing the west wall where dust loves to creep. He could see the strain in her shoulders, the shadow that passed over her face when she lifted too fast, and he slowed their pace without announcing it, arranging the work so every hard pull had a calmer task to follow. She understood what he did and did not resist it. Acceptance, too, can be a kind of strength. By the time the wind arrived full, the air had browned into a near night, and the sound of it came low and steady, like a train of ghosts crossing the flats. They sealed the door with damp cloth and pushed rag into the window cracks. Inside, the lamp haloed them with warm gold, while the world outside turned to breathless roar. Grit found its way through, as grit will. It dusted their hair and clung to the rim of bowls, and the stove's mouth glowed like a quiet star, a small anchor of warmth. They spoke little, and when they did, it was only what mattered. There. Hold. Careful. Words like stitches pulling a rent closed. When she coughed, he passed her the damp cloth, and she pressed it to her mouth, breathing through it until her chest eased. "How long?" she asked once. "A while," he said gently, and set another kettle to heat. Time slipped into a soft, uncertain stretch. They took turns dozing upright, waking to tend the lamp or stuff a new seam. Once, as she slept, her head tipped forward, and he slid his folded coat beneath her cheek. Her breath steadied. The lines by her mouth loosened. He sat then and watched the small movements of her rest, the courage it takes to surrender to sleep when life has taught you to stay awake. He remembered her as a child on the creek bank, back against a sun-warmed rock, eyes half closed, while water talked in a language the heart understands. The memory felt like water now, cooling, cleansing, passing over the stones of his spirit until something tight within him finally unfisted. When the wind died, dawn stepped in as if it had been waiting politely just beyond the door. He opened it to a land made different and the same. Fences drifted with dust, troughs grainy but full, the windmill still turning. Nearly came to stand beside him, shawl drawn close, and together they took the measure of the damage with calm eyes, It was work, not ruin. Work they could do. Relief passed between them like the simplest prayer. He looked at her and knew they had endured something together that could not be undone. They spent the day setting things right. He shoveled while she swept grit from corners, and when she tired, he handed her the bracing wedge and took the heavier labor without comment. She did not apologize, and he did not expect it. When they paused for water, she leaned her shoulder to the doorframe and listened to the quieter world, the way the land had settled back onto itself. "It could have taken us," she said, not in fear, only in truth. "It did not," he answered. Their eyes met with a steadiness that felt new, like two branches braided together by wind and finding that the hold was stronger than either had known. Word of the storm's passage brought other weather with it, the weather of people. The storekeeper's boy wandered the road again, braver this time, lingering at the fence as if the storm had scoured some of his fear away. He darted off only when Elias stepped toward him. A woman at the well lifted her chin in a not-quite greeting when Nieli passed, as though gratitude had begun a long journey to her face and had not quite arrived. Such small changes matter, even in a hard place. They are seeds, and seeds, given patience, become shelter. In the afternoon, while the land still held quiet from the storm, 2 riders appeared at the edge of the north road. Elias felt them before he saw them, sensed the way the horizon's line thinned around their approach. Men who'd ridden far, their dusters stiff with travel, their eyes sharp, the kind who followed tracks for a living. He told himself they might be nothing. The coil of warning in his gut said otherwise. He set his shovel down and rested an arm on the fence, not casual, not ready to draw, simply not afraid to be seen. Nieli noticed his stillness and looked to the road. She did not retreat. Her hands settled at her sides, open and sure. "Afternoon," the taller rider said when they drew up. There was no courtesy in it. "We're looking for an Apache woman passed through after a skirmish near the river. Heard she came this way." The second rider's gaze drifted past Elias toward the door where Nieli stood. Silence stretched, wind ticked in the grass. Elias felt the space where choice lives. A clean, bright space inside a man that is also an edge. He had turned away from edges before and had learned what it costs. He could choose quiet again and watch a good thing be carried off into dust. Or he could say a word that would set the course of everything that followed. He didn't have to find the word. It found him. "You'll need county papers," he said evenly. "Warrants, not rumors." The tall man spat and grinned the way snakes grin, thin and false. "We've got bounty notices in Prescott. We'll take her and ride." Elias didn't blink. "Without papers, you won't." The second man's hand drifted near his belt. Nieli did not move. The steadiness of her presence strengthened him like an arm bracing his back. He thought of her stitching her wound under lamplight, of her hands on the wire, of her quiet patience when the sky tried to break the world. He thought of the word "we." It was a simple thing, and it changed the weight in his mouth. "She's under my roof," he said, not loud, not soft. "That makes her my concern." The sheriff appeared then, as if the land itself had called him. His horse breathed clouds into the cool, and his eyes were tired but awake. "Papers?" he asked the riders, his tone bored enough to be dangerous. They had none. The standoff softened, then broke, the men turning away with curses like chipped glass tossed into dirt. The sheriff watched them go, then turned his gaze on Elias. Some kind of understanding passed between them, plain and unadorned. "You're in it now," he said, "not as a threat, only as a fact." "I know," Elias answered. Evening brought a quieter kind of wind. Nieli stood on the stoop, her fingers curled around the rail, and breathed out slowly. "You did not have to," she said, voice steady as a brook in spring. He leaned against the post and looked at her the way a man looks at water after heat. "I did." That was all. That was enough. Days settled in, shovels and sweeping, coffee, and the soft thud of boots by the door, her shawl hanging beside his hat on the peg. He went to town for flour and nails. The storekeeper's eyes were less narrow than they had been, and his wife slides a small sack of coffee across the counter, not speaking of thanks, but letting gratitude rest in the space between. Elias paid in cash and said only, "She'll need the cloth," when he added a bolt of coarse cotton to the pile. The words she and need wove a quiet thread through the room. No one picked at it. Back home, Nieli folded the cloth with care, her fingers learning the weave as if reading it, then mended Elias's shirt with small, strong stitches that held like meaning. He slipped it on and felt the way her attention had become part of the garment, warmth sewn into the seam. In the evenings, they sat near the corral and let memory drift across them like a river wind. "You traded me bread," she said once, eyes soft. "You gave me smoked meat," he answered. They fell to silence then, not from absence but from fullness, the kind that doesn't require more words. On a bright, plain morning, the sheriff rode in with a folded packet from the county seat. He handed it down from the saddle and said, "Homestead claim on the back quarters open. File it in both names." He didn't linger. Dust took his horse around the bend. Elias opened the papers at the table while Nieli stood beside him, the space between them so small that their shoulders nearly touched. He read slowly, feeling the weight of each line as it moved through him. Land, name, standing. He looked up. Her eyes held his, clear and cautious, brave. "Saturday," he said. "We'll ride in and file." She searched his face, as if to be sure the ground wouldn't give way beneath her feet. "You would give my name to the county on your land?" He shook his head once. "Our land," he said simply, and the words settled in the room like a bell tone that takes a long time to fade. The week moved like a river, water over stones, clean and steady. They worked with a different feeling now, not patching, building. When she walked the far fence alone and returned with wild herbs for medicine, he let the rifle hang on its hooks by the door. Trust is not the absence of danger. It is the presence of someone beside you when danger comes. The air seemed to understand this. It drew easier into their lungs. The town, too, changed in small ways that matter. A nod here, a neutral silence there, a boy who dared ask Elias if the woman at his house had a name. "Nearly," Elias said, and the boy ran off singing the sound of it under his breath as if it tasted good. But rough places do not turn gentle all at once. One evening, as the light thinned and the cattle pressed contentedly to the fence, 3 riders came slow up the north road, the kind of men who used laughter like a blade. Dust swirled around their horses' legs. The scarred one spat grit and showed his teeth. "Paper or no paper?" he called, loud enough to stain the air. "Folks don't take kindly to an Apache woman playing homesteader." Elias stepped onto the porch with his hand nowhere near the holster and his voice flat as a slate. "You've had your say. Now ride." Hands brushed metal. Nieli's fingers found the gate latch, steady as stone. Before the moment could tip, the sheriff's voice slid from the elm's shadow, low, calm, and carrying the iron of the county. "That's far enough." The night changed its shape. The three men turned away with curses that fell like dull coins. Inside afterward, under lamplight, Nieli laid her hand over Elias's, where it rested on the table, not as thanks or plea, but as a mark. His own hand turned and held hers, their fingers lacing like new roots, finding purchase in deep soil. They did not speak. They did not need to. The house took their silence and made a home of it. Soon the day would come when they rode to the county seat to press their names beside one another on a page that would anchor their lives to this stubborn, beautiful ground. But even before ink met paper, the choice had already been made. In the open gate, in the steadying hand, in the simple word, "our," that had begun to soften the land's hard edges. The morning they set out, the sky would be pale and clear, and the road would offer itself with all its old uncertainties and quiet promises, a ribbon of earth leading not only toward a clerk's desk and a stamped claim, but toward something larger and gentler, a life shaped together by work, courage, and the healing tenderness of two hearts that had found their way back to the same horizon. Saturday came quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a hand smoothed over the brow of the earth. They set out before the sun had burned the pale edge of dawn, Elias with his old hat pulled low, and Nieli with her shawl pinned tight against the early chill. The road unrolled ahead of them, a ribbon of hard-packed dust and rutted memory, leading toward the county seat where names became law and land learned who to belong to. They did not hurry. The horses found their rhythm, hooves thudding soft, breath clouding the cool air. Between them lay the steady companionship of two people who had chosen, without fanfare, to walk toward a future and call it home. The town at the county seat woke slow, too, shutters opening on creak-worn hinges, a baker's door yawning flower-scented into the street, children darting like sparrows through puddles left by last night's brief, blessed rain. Elias tied the horses at the post and glanced at Nieli. If there was fear in her, it hid beneath a poise she had learned on harsher roads, the kind of steadiness that says, "I have been chased enough to know the power of standing still." He offered his arm without ceremony, and she took it, not for support, but for the pleasure of walking in step. Inside the clerk's office, everything smelled of ink and dry wood. The walls held shelves of leather-backed ledgers, their spines stamped with years like vertical scars. A clock ticked with stubborn dignity. The clerk looked up, face impassive, eyes flickering over Elias first, then pausing on Nieli. In that pause lay the whole country's argument, a ledger of who had the right to remain and who did not. Elias set the folded notice on the desk, his voice calm. "We're filing a homestead claim on the back quarter. Both names." He said it as if there were no other reasonable way to say it. The clerk took a breath, as if tasting the request on the air. Then he nodded to the paper, dipped his pen, and began the slow work of spelling lives into lines. "Names," he said. "Elias Carver." The clerk wrote, and the clock ticked. "And yours, miss?" A heartbeat of silence, and then Nieli, daughter of Taza, spoke the letters as he had taught her at the table by lamplight, careful and sure. Her name crossed the page like a river laid on a map, slender but undeniable. The clerk did not look up again. He blotted the ink, pressed the seal, and slid the deed forward with a motion so ordinary it felt like mercy. "You'll want a copy to keep on your person," he said, and perhaps he did not mean kindness, and perhaps he did, but the deed shone in the lamplight just the same. Outside, the noon sun had claimed the sky. Elias folded the paper into Nieli's pouch, and she touched the leather with a reverence that was not about property, but about roots, a sensation as gentle and startling as feeling water soak into parched ground. "We should head back," he said, but they did not mount yet. They walked once around the square, past the baker's window where loaves cooled in neat brown rows, past the blacksmith's yard where a colt raised its head and stamped, past the church steps where a girl in a blue dress traced lazy circles with her toe in the dust. Nothing in that walk asked for them, and yet they walked it together as if to tell the day, "We are here, and this is not borrowed time." On the road home, the wind was kinder, carrying the scent of sage bruised by hooves. They rode close, the kind of closeness that listens. "An hour from the settlement," Elias said, almost to himself. "I've put my name on few things, less that I care to keep." He felt her glance like the brush of a warm wing. "Today you kept," she answered, simple as bread, and the words rested in him like a soft stone, weighty and centering. When the ridge lifted into view and the windmill's blades flashed with the sun, he exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Work folded itself around them again, as work will. The back quarter needed stones picked and brush stacked low. The troughs wanted scrubbing. A gate hinge squealed for oil. News travels on quieter feet than trouble, and over the next days the settlement's posture shifted by an inch. No more, but an inch is plenty for a seedling to find light. The storekeeper no longer tracked Nieli's every step when she entered. His wife, apron flowered and eyes bright with a guarded kindness, slipped a small bag of coffee into the bundle and nodded as if to say, "I saw what you did on paper." Quiet respect blooming under dust. The true turn arrived not on paper, not in any office, but at the well behind the church. It was late afternoon, the hour when shadows sharpen and the air settles into its hottest stillness, when a cry cracked across the square like a rope snapping. Elias looked up from the hardware he'd come to buy. Nieli had already set down the basket of nails and moved toward the sound with the swiftness of someone who has learned that waiting wastes lives. At the well, a circle of men and women had formed, not yet a mob, but that same skittish energy. A child's mother knelt, hands torn bloody where the stone rims scraped them, her voice ragged with despair. The rope was too short, the cover had rotted, the boy had fallen. Nieli eased through the bodies with the gentleness of a blade drawn from a sheath. "Rope," she said, clear as a bell. "A long one." People stared, stalled by fear and habit. Elias, arriving at her shoulder, caught the end of a coil and thrust it to her, his hands already cinching a knot as their eyes met. The trust between them was a tool, too, quick, simple, reliable. "Hold me steady," she said for his ears alone, and he braced his boots and bent his knees, the rope running through his palms like a live vein. The dark inside the well rose against her like a wall of breath. Stones bit her shoulders, cold damp licked her throat. "I see him," she called, and the mother sobbed once as if her heart cracked open and kept beating. The boy clung to a nub of rock, small hands slick, eyes wide and wild. "Arms," Nilly murmured, the tone a lullaby, and the boys, shaking, reached for her as if he'd been born to that voice. She looped the rope around them both, knotted high, then looked up. "Pull!" Elias felt the weight of 2 lives in his hands and leaned into it with his whole body. Men who had stared in suspicion now stepped beside him, their shoulders heaving, their breath loud in their throats. Together they lifted. The rope sang against stone, fibers complaining, then holding, then gliding. When Nieli's head broke through the circle of sky, a sound rose, not a cheer, not yet, but the first rush of breath after someone has been too long underwater. Hands closed around the child and hauled him over. He cried once, a raw, healthy sound, and buried his face in his mother's neck. Nieli pulled herself up the last inches and sat on the earth, leaning one palm to steady the world. Dust clung to her lashes, her ribs protested, her mouth curved in a smile too tired to show teeth. Elias knelt, pressed a damp cloth to her hands, and the crowd's murmur shifted its shape. "Thank you," the storekeeper's wife said, voice thick. The pastor, sweat beading his temples, lowered his head, a small bow, honest and unpolished. Sheriff Burke arrived then at a measured trot, dismounted, took in the scene, and nodded once at Elias, once at Nieli. In his eyes was not surprise. It was the recognition of the kind of courage that does not ask for notice. For the rest of that evening, when Nieli walked through town at Elias's side, the looks that followed them felt less like stones thrown and more like windows cracked open to let air in. Back at the homestead, a hush had gentled the yard, the kind that comes after fear passes without taking anyone. Elias set a basin by the door and poured clean water over her scraped hands, cupping her fingers in his to wash away grit and the bitter smell of old water. She watched him and did not look away. "You held me steady," she said, and in it was everything that had been true since the day she'd stepped through his gate. "You were steady," he answered. Between them, a quiet warmth spread, like tea seeping into the ache of a long night. Days lengthened. Wind combed the grass and moved on. They stacked brush for the windbreak, layer by patient layer, and set thin poles for beans to climb. When Elias's shirt tore at the shoulder, she mended it with the same neat, strong stitches she had used to close her own skin under his lamplight, the thread pulled through and made of the tear a history, not a wound. He wore it and felt the weight of her care settle into the cloth. At night they sat on the stoop and watched the sky burn down into embers. He told her once, voice low, "When I was a boy, I envied how you could sit still and hear the water talking." She smiled. "I still hear it," she said, "even when the creek is dry." He believed her. Trouble did not forget them. It rarely forgets anyone who dares to rebuild. Near sundown, several nights after the rescue, 3 men rode in slow, faces hard with the brittle anger of those who mistake cowardice for pride. The scarred one leaned forward in his saddle, spit into Elias's yard, and let a smile coil. "This place ain't big enough for county law and Apache wives," he said, as if the words were a clever blade. Elias did not touch his gun. He stood with one hand on the porch post and his other at his side, easy, patient, steady. "You're on my fence," he said, "and you're finished." The second man's hand drifted toward his belt, and the twilight gathered itself into a thin hunger. The sheriff's voice slid out of the elm's shadows like a line-leveling string. "That's far enough." His revolver hung low, not trembling. Men who had spent their lives misreading others misread him too, and thought better of it. They turned with curses that sounded smaller in the cool air and rode, their silhouettes thinning against the dust. When the sheriff holstered his gun and faced Elias, nothing triumphant passed between them, only the sober exchange of men who know what it costs to stand. "You've chosen," he said. "We chose," Elias answered, eyes cutting to Nearly. The sheriff nodded and rode on. Inside, the lamplight swam in a small golden circle as Nearly laid her hand on Elias's, palm to palm, a simple joining that felt like a pledge etched where no one else could see. "I will not run," she said, the words not a boast, but a homecoming. "Then we will not chase anything that tries to drive us," he replied. Silence settled between them, not empty, but full of the tender steadiness that grows when fear has been faced and found smaller than love. The pastor started visiting on Sundays, a Bible tucked under his arm and a pragmatic kindness in his eyes. He asked few questions. He stood at their fence and listened to the wind rattle through the new brush, to the windmill creak its slow hymns. One afternoon he unfolded a scrap of paper and cleared his throat. "There's another way to write what is already true," he said, voice quiet enough to keep from spooking anything. "If you want it." His gaze took in the 2 mugs by the stoop, the 2 pairs of boots by the door, the shawl beside the hat, the mended shirt on Elias's shoulder, the way their names had learned to stand side by side on the deed. He did not press. He only offered. They looked at one another then with the calm that has no need to dress itself up. No fireworks, no grand gestures, just the solid knowledge of storms outlasted, work shared, a life in the making. Nearly's eyes were soft and steady as she spoke. "Yes." Elias's answer came like breath. "Yes." The pastor did not smile like a man collecting a victory. He smiled like a man relieved to witness 2 lives aligning with the truth he had seen all along. The day they wed, the sky kept itself blue and the wind behaved. Sheriff Burke stood witness, and the storekeeper's wife held a small bouquet of sage and wildflowers she had cut herself, fingers thorn-pricked and unconcerned. The pastor's words were uncluttered. The vows were shorter than the years that had led to them. No rings, no music, only names spoken aloud in a yard that had learned to hold both. When the paper was signed, the pastor pressed his palm over their joined hands for a brief, heartfelt moment. "May the land you keep you," he said, and something eased in everyone who heard it. Evening found them on the stoop again, listening to the world exhale. The cattle shifted, content. The windbreak cast a thin, promising shadow. A kettle clicked as it cooled. Elias leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and watched Nearly, watching the horizon. He thought of the first day she had walked into his yard and said, "Don't you recognize me?" And of all the ways recognition had unfolded since. A cup of water, a lamp held steady, a rope held tighter, a word, our, spoken without pride. He felt the quiet interior warmth that comes when a man realizes he is no longer alone in the work of being alive. They did not speak of forever. They spoke of the fence that needed straightening, of the way beans like to climb if you give them something to hold, of where to set a small orchard when the rains favored them. Such talk is a kind of tenderness. It says, "I see tomorrow, and I see you in it." When night deepened and the lamp went out, the house did not feel darker. It felt truer. 2 steady breaths, 1 room, a future written not by odds or anger, but by 1,000 faithful gestures that together form a life. The settlement would never soften into sweetness. It was not built for that. But it had learned, in fits and starts, to be fair enough, which is sometimes the most a hard place can manage. The well behind the church wore a new cover, planked, chained, and trusted. Riders who had tested boundaries found them firmer than before. The boy who had been pulled from the dark waved whenever he saw Nieli and jabbered with a half-toothless grin about anything that entered his bright, unbroken head. In the store, the clatter of scoops and ledgers sometimes paused and turned to quiet when Elias and Nieli entered, not out of hostility now, but out of the old human curiosity about how courage looks when it grows leaves and shade. When the heat rose again and days slowed into the timelessness of work, they walked the far edge of the homestead at dusk, the sky smudged with rose and dust blue. Elias carried a shovel over his shoulder. Nieli carried a small bundle of dried herbs in her palm, their scent clean and soft. "If we set a line of stones here," he said, "the runoff will keep in place." She nodded and scattered a few seeds from her pocket where the soil darkened near the ridge. They knelt and pressed them under, hands dirty and sure. They did not pray aloud. They did not have to. The earth knew what to do with quiet hope, and as the first star pricked the sky, the future felt not like a distant country, but like a path already underfoot, leading them forward, together, into the gentle, patient miracle of a home maturing by the day. Summer opened its palms wide across the plains, laying heat down heavy as if to remind every living thing how fragile breath could be. The soil cracked where the sun lingered too long. Cattle stood with heads low under the windbreak, and even the air seemed to grow tired, moving slow, thick with dust and cicadas. Yet within that heat, life pressed forward, steady and insistent. Corn sprouted along the back quarter where Nieli had shown Elias how to set brush low. Beans climbed the poles she had set with her small, careful hands. What had once been a yard meant for solitude now breathed like something shared, and every row of green whispered the same truth. Roots deepen when tended together. Nieli woke before the sun most mornings, her shawl gathered at her shoulders as she stepped into the yard, bare feet brushing against cool earth still damp with night. She moved slowly, for her ribs had never fully healed, but her strength returned in ways more subtle, the steadiness of her breath, the resilience of her gaze, the quiet patience in her hands as she pulled weeds or tied new growth. Elias often rose to find her already working, and though he scolded her sometimes with the sharpness of worry, she answered only with a smile that said plainly, "I am alive. I must live." That smile did something to him, something softening and steadying all at once, like rain finally finding thirsty ground. When noon settled hard upon them, they worked side by side, repairing fences or digging shallow trenches for runoff. Sweat darkening their clothes, dust clinging to their hair. They spoke in fragments. "Pull it tighter. Pass the wire. That'll hold." But the silence around those words carried more weight than any long conversation. In that silence lived trust, and in that trust lived the kind of intimacy that doesn't demand attention, but thrives quietly, like shade growing along a wall. Sometimes, when the heat pressed too heavy, Elias would fill a bucket at the pump and pour it slowly over her hands, the water spilling cool and silver against her wrists. She would laugh softly, and that sound, low, tired, but undeniably alive, became the gentlest healing balm against the loneliness he had carried for years. The settlement continued to watch them, sometimes with narrowed eyes, sometimes with curiosity that hovered between suspicion and respect. The memory of Nieli lowering herself into the well, rope biting into her waist to save a child, had not faded. Mothers at the store, who once turned away, now glanced longer, some with faint nods, others with silence that at least lacked hostility. Children pointed from the edge of the square, whispering her name as though it were a story worth repeating. Elias knew better than to trust too quickly, but he also knew that the hardest walls sometimes shift when pressed by steady acts of courage. One afternoon, as they walked into town for supplies, Nieli kept her steps calm, though her heart raced. It had been months since she could cross a settlement openly without expecting spit or stones. Beside her, Elias's stride was easy, yet his hand never strayed far from hers. At the store, the keeper weighed flour without narrowing his eyes this time. His wife slid a small jar of coffee across the counter, wrapped in paper, and said nothing more than, "For thanks," her voice low. Nieli met her eyes and nodded, a gesture heavy with all the words neither dared to speak. Outside, as they loaded supplies onto the wagon, Elias glanced sideways and said quietly, "They're seeing you." She answered, "They're seeing us," and the pronoun wrapped itself around him like shade in the desert. Evenings grew into rituals of stillness. After the cattle were settled and the yard swept clean, they sat together on the stoop, listening to the windmills creak and the hushed breath of land cooling from the day's blaze. Sometimes Elias spoke of his brother, of the weight of guilt he had never been able to put down. Sometimes Nieli spoke of her father, of the songs he had sung low by the fire, songs now scattered like ash with her people. Each story was a piece of stone placed carefully in the foundation they were building. They did not speak of love in grand declarations, but in quiet offerings, his hand steady at her back when she faltered, her stitching his torn shirt without being asked, the way their breaths found rhythm in the night air. Healing, they learned, was not a sudden mercy, but 1,000 small gestures carried faithfully. Yet storms of another kind still rose. Late one evening, with the sky bruised violet and the horizon carrying the smell of rain, riders approached again, different men, their faces hard, their laughter cruel. They leaned on the fence, spat into the dirt, and spoke with the careless venom of those who believe power rests in threat. "Carver," one called, "you've chosen wrong company. Paper or no paper, she don't belong." Elias stood at the porch, revolver loose at his side, but not raised. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "This is our land. She belongs." Nieli had stepped closer by then, her hand steady on the gate latch, and in her eyes was no fear, only a fierce steadiness that made her seem taller than she was. The standoff stretched long enough for the world to hold its breath. Then, once again, Sheriff Burke appeared, hoarse, dark with sweat, revolver hanging low at his hip. His presence was enough. He didn't need to raise his weapon. His voice, even and edged with authority, carried the weight of law. The riders spat curses and turned back into the dark, leaving dust and silence behind. When they were gone, Nieli laid her hand lightly over Elias's, pressing into his knuckles with a touch that said more than words. He looked down, then up at her face, and though no promises were spoken, the bond between them tightened like rope drawn fast. The weeks that followed were filled with the kind of work that shapes more than land. Nieli planted herbs along the edge of the fence, teaching Elias how to dry them for medicine. He ploughed deeper into the soil, turning earth that resisted until it yielded. Together they stacked stones, mended boards, and tended cattle. The rhythm of the days no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned, as though every choice had carved their names deeper into the land. When the pastor came with his quiet question about marriage, about sealing with law what was already true in practice, they looked at each other and answered without hesitation. Yes. The wedding itself was plain. 2 witnesses, a paper signed, vows short and steady as footsteps. No rings, no music, no flowers beyond what the storekeeper's wife had picked from her yard. But in its simplicity lay a profound beauty, like water cupped in calloused hands. When Nieli and Elias signed their names side by side, the page carried not just ink, but survival, trust, and the decision to remain. That evening, as they ate cornbread and beans by lamplight, neither spoke of forever. They did not need to. The paper in her pouch, the quiet between them, the touch of her hand against his on the table, all of it spoke more clearly than vows could. As the summer deepened, the land answered their labor. Corn grew tall along the windbreak, beans twisted green and insistent, cattle fattened, and the windmill turned steady in the afternoon breeze. The emptiness that had once lived in Elias's house was gone. 2 pairs of boots stood by the door. 2 shawls hung on the peg. The silence was no longer hollow. It was shared, filled with warmth that rose from meals cooked together, from laughter rare but real, from the healing presence of another heartbeat close by. One evening, as the sun slid low and the air cooled sweet, Elias leaned on the corral and watched Nieli walk the far fence, her braids swinging against her back, her steps sure. He thought of the first day she had appeared at his gate, half-starved and trembling, asking, "Don't you recognize me, Cowboy?" And he thought of all that had followed, storms, threats, small mercies, choices carved into the marrow of their days. When she returned and stood beside him, he reached for her hand without hesitation. She placed it in his, not as thanks, not as promise, but as belonging. The land would never be gentle, and the settlement would never become tender. Yet the home they had made pulsed with life, with steadiness, with love rooted not in fragile words, but in acts repeated daily. And as the sky bruised itself into night, and the stars began to burn awake, they stood together in the healing quiet of their own making, knowing that whatever storms might come again, they would endure, not as 2 souls fighting alone, but as one life, shared and chosen, steady as the wind turning the blades above their home. The days lengthened into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like the shaping of a life, steady as breath, tender as a hand laid softly across a wound. The corn reached higher along the back quarter, tassels gilded in the light, while beans coiled upward as though they knew a future worth reaching for. Nieli rose with the dawn, often before Elias stirred from his bed, her shawl brushing the cool morning air as she swept the stoop, gathered herbs, or checked the water troughs. Each movement was small, simple, but in those gestures lay the kind of healing that remakes broken ground, ordinary tasks carrying extraordinary meaning because they were done together, side by side, and no longer in silence. Elias would watch her sometimes from the doorway, his arms folded across his chest, the faint trace of a smile hiding beneath his beard. He saw not the scars first, nor the years of wandering marked into her skin, but the way she carried herself now with steadiness, as if roots had at last found soil strong enough to hold them. Her laughter was still rare, but when it came, low, warm, a sound as soft as water moving over smooth stone, it pierced through the hard edges of his days, settling something restless inside him. He found himself waiting for it, working for it, treasuring it as a man treasures rain on a parched morning. In the evenings they shared meals at the worn table, and though the dishes were plain, beans, cornbread, strips of pork stretched thin, the taste was fuller for being eaten in company. She seasoned with wild herbs, sage, and a touch of mint when she could find it, and he swore the air itself softened with each simmer. They did not speak of love openly, not yet, but in the way she laid his bowl first on the table, and the way he kept her cup filled without asking, it was there. Love as presence, love as care, love as the quiet healing balm that stitched itself through the hours without demanding notice. The settlement, though never warm, had shifted into something less sharp. Whispers still drifted, but they no longer carried the same venom. The memory of the boy lifted from the well remained in people's mouths, retold in cautious tones. Some who had once turned their backs now offered the smallest of nods, as if reluctant to admit what they felt: respect. Nearly sensed it, but did not lean on it. She had lived long enough to know how quickly tolerance could turn back into suspicion. Still, she allowed herself to breathe easier when walking through town, to let her shoulders rest a little lower, to feel the sunlight touch her, without fear that shadows would follow. One Sunday afternoon, Pastor Green rode out, Bible tucked under his arm, his face carrying the calm of a man who had witnessed too many storms to be startled by much. He sat with them beneath the elm and spoke little at first, letting the windmill creak and the cattle shift in the corral. Finally, he unfolded a paper, asked the question in his plain, steady way. Did they want their names not only on land, but bound in marriage, a union written as firmly as a homestead claim? Elias looked at Nayeli then, not with surprise, but with the calm certainty of a man who already knew his answer. Her gaze held his, clear, steady, carrying no fear. "Yes," she said, and the word hung in the air like sunlight. Elias echoed it with a quiet finality that felt like an anchor dropping. The pastor nodded, as though he had only confirmed what was already true. The ceremony came a week later, unadorned, stripped of grandeur, and because of that, it felt holy. Sheriff Burke and the storekeeper's wife stood as witnesses. The pastor read short vows, words older than all of them, words meant to steady rather than dazzle. There were no rings, no flowers, no feast, only the two of them standing in their own yard as the wind moved gently through the brush they had stacked together. Elias signed his name, slow but firm, and Nieli pressed hers beside his, each letter deliberate, carrying the weight of survival, of choice, of belonging. When the ink dried, it was done, and yet it felt as if it had been true long before paper and pen. That evening, after the witnesses rode back to town and the pastor's dust had settled beyond the ridge, Elias and Nieli sat on the stoop, the lamplight behind them, the stars beginning to rise. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, and he laid his hand over hers where it curled in her lap. No words passed, because none were needed. The silence was whole, healing, the kind that carries warmth without weight. In that moment, the world felt less like an enemy and more like a companion, as if the very land had finally allowed them space to rest. Summer pressed forward, testing them with heat and long hours, but they met each day as one. They repaired posts side by side, planted more herbs against the fence line, tended cattle together, and in each task the thread of their bond wove tighter. At night, when the air cooled and the horizon burned down into embers, they would walk the yard in slow steps, her braids swinging lightly, his hand brushing hers, both knowing that they no longer moved alone. Healing does not come all at once, but in the steady choosing of each other day after day. And by choosing, they had turned loneliness into belonging, survival into life, and silence into the soft, steady language of love. The horizon still carried threats. Men with restless hearts, prejudice that did not vanish overnight, storms that could rise without warning. But within their home was a steadiness that no rider's threat, no whisper of suspicion could undo. As Elias hung his hat beside her shawl, as her herbs dried in neat bundles above the stove, as two pairs of boots stood together by the door, it was clear what had begun as chance, as desperate survival, had grown into a life bound not by fear, but by the quiet strength of love, chosen and re-chosen every dawn. And from that strength they stepped gently, without rush, into the next chapter of their days, ready to face whatever waited with the healing certainty of not being alone. The weeks after their marriage carried with them a new kind of quiet, less fragile, less uncertain, more like a calm river that had finally found its bed and knew how to flow. Their home no longer felt like borrowed shelter, but like a place grown from their very breath, every board and every stone infused with the warmth of two lives stitched together. Elias moved differently now, not with the restless pacing of a man guarding solitude, but with the grounded steadiness of one who understood that another heart beat within his care. Nieli moved differently too. Her steps carried less hesitation, her gaze lifted more often to the horizon, as if the land itself had softened under her presence and accepted her. Healing had begun to seep into them both, like light through cracks in old wood, patient and unstoppable. The mornings were filled with work, but work done together became a kind of intimacy. She swept the porch while he brought in buckets of water, her braid catching the breeze as he passed with tools on his shoulder. When they mended fences, she held the boards steady while he hammered, their hands brushing in brief moments that lingered longer in the heart than in time. He would glance at her, see the sweat gathering along her brow, and without words, hand her the water dipper. She would drink, and in her eyes was gratitude, not just for the water, but for the constancy of his watchful presence. Each act was small, yet everyone carried the weight of love, quiet, tender, warm as the sun after a storm. The settlement, though never free of suspicion, began to bend beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Nellie was no longer only the stranger who had arrived wounded and worn. She had become the woman who saved a child, who worked the land with discipline, who walked beside Elias Carver with dignity. At the store, whispers lessened. At the well, women began to glance not away, but toward her. some with hesitant nods that carried more meaning than words. Children followed her with their eyes, curiosity overtaking fear, their voices calling her name as if it had become part of their stories. It was not full acceptance, but it was something better than exile. It was space to breathe. One day, when the sky hung heavy with clouds promising rain, Elias returned from town with a bolt of finer cloth than he usually bought. He laid it on the table without ceremony. Nellie touched it gently, her fingers tracing the weave, and when she looked at him, her smile carried softness he had rarely seen so open on her face. She sewed a shirt for him with it, each stitch neat, strong, binding her care into every seam. When he wore it, he felt her presence wrapped around him, a reminder with every movement that his solitude was no longer his alone. That evening she mended his coat by the lamplight, and he sat across from her, watching the steady grace of her hands, feeling in that moment that no riches in the world could weigh as much as the peace her presence brought into his home. The pastor visited sometimes, bringing words not of doctrine but of encouragement, his weathered voice carrying reminders that healing often comes not through sermons, but through living kindness. He saw the way Elias and Nieli worked in rhythm, the way their silence spoke, and he would leave with a small smile that said he had witnessed something holy in the ordinary. Sheriff Burke rode by less often now, though when he did, he tipped his hat with a respect that spoke of battles fought and choices honored. His eyes no longer carried warning, but acknowledgment, as though he understood that this bond had become unshakable. Storms still tested them. A late summer tempest rolled across the flats, driving rain sideways, threatening to tear loose the roof and drown the young crops. Together they ran into the yard, tying shutters, driving stakes deeper, their clothes soaked, hair plastered to their faces. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled like the anger of heaven, and yet in that chaos they found each other's hands. They held on, not out of desperation but solidarity, and when the storm passed, leaving the land drenched but still standing, they laughed, breathless, wet, alive. That laughter carried healing of its own, washing away the last remnants of loneliness clinging to their hearts. As the season shifted toward autumn, the land bore fruit for their labor. Corn ripened golden, beans hung heavy, herbs dried in neat bundles above the stove. The house smelled of harvest, of earth giving back, of a home becoming rooted. Nieli taught Elias to brew tea from sage and mint, a drink that soothed weary bones and brought a sense of calm even after long days. He, in turn, taught her how to carve simple wooden handles for tools, shaping them smooth and strong. Together they created not just shelter, but a life woven of usefulness and care, each giving what the other lacked, each receiving what the other offered. In the evenings, when work lay finished, they often sat by the corral, the cattle moving slow and content under the fading light. Elias would sometimes speak of his brother, of the silence left behind by his death, of the guilt he had carried for years. Nieli listened with the patience of one who understood loss too well, her hand steady on his, offering not answers but presence. At other times she spoke of her people, of the songs once sung around firelight, the dances under starlit skies, voices now scattered by violence. He listened without interruption, honoring each word as if it were a prayer. In those exchanges, healing passed between them, subtle but strong, knitting together what grief had torn. One night, beneath a sky alive with stars, Elias confessed in a voice roughened by restraint, When you came that day, I almost didn't open the gate." Neely turned to him, her face calm, her eyes carrying the strength of survival. "And yet you did," she whispered. His answer was a slow nod, steady, unshakable. "I won't close it again." She placed her hand in his then, not as gratitude, not as promise, but as belonging. The silence that followed was full, luminous, healing. A silence not of emptiness, but of lives intertwined. Their love grew not in declarations, but in the constancy of every dawn shared, every storm endured, every small act of care. It was love that healed, because it was rooted in truth, in survival, in the decision to remain when leaving might have been easier. And though the world beyond their land remained unpredictable, though prejudice lingered and storms would always come, within their home was a steadiness that no force could shake. Two hearts that had once wandered apart now beat as one, and together they faced each horizon with quiet courage, knowing that healing and love had become their strongest inheritance. And as autumn deepened, painting the plains with copper light and long shadows, Elias and Nieli stood often at the edge of their field, watching the wind bend the tall corn, the beans curling strong, the earth itself thriving beneath their care. They did not need to speak of what they saw, for it was written clearly. Their lives had become not merely survival, but a testament to love's resilience, to healing born from choice, to the unyielding truth that home is not just a place, but the heart that chooses to stay. Winter crept across the land, not with sudden violence, but with a slow, steady claiming, the kind that seeps into the soil and air until even breath feels touched by frost. The fields, once golden and full, stood bare, the cornstalks cut down, the bean poles stripped of their vines, the earth resting as if to gather its strength for spring. Snow dusted the ridge in pale sheets, and the wind carried a sharper bite. Yet within the small house Elias and Nieli had made their own, warmth lingered. The stove burned steady, its iron belly glowing. Herbs hung above the door, faintly perfuming the air with sage and mint, and the sound of two voices softened the silence that had once belonged only to loneliness. The house, once hollow, now pulsed with life. Elias rose each morning with the same discipline he had always carried, but now there was an ease in his shoulders, a steadiness not born from solitude, but from the knowledge that Nieli shared the burden of each day. She woke with him, though the cold often made her ribs ache, and together they tended cattle, broke ice in the troughs, and carried wood into the yard. The work was hard, but shared labor transformed hardship into intimacy. He would chop, and she would gather the splinters for kindling. She would sweep, and he would steady the broom when her hand trembled from old wounds. Each action said what words rarely touched. "I see you. I stand with you." Evenings became their sanctuary. When the light faded early and the wind pressed against the walls, they sat together by the stove, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Elias carved simple shapes from wood, his knife moving slow, and Nieli patched shirts or wove small strands of cord from dried fibers, her hands patient and sure. The silence between them was not heavy. It was healing, the kind of quiet that holds rather than weighs. When their eyes met in that golden glow, it was enough. No declarations needed, no speeches. Their very nearness was its own vow. One night, as snow fell in faint whispers against the window, Nieli sang a fragment of a song her father had taught her. The melody was low, winding like a stream under ice, tender and haunting. Elias listened with his head bowed, his hands stilling on the wood, his chest tightening at the raw beauty of the sound. He had not heard her sing before, and the fragility of it made him ache, not because it was sorrowful, but because it carried resilience, the echo of people scattered yet unbroken. When her voice faded, he reached across the space and laid his hand over hers. She looked at him, eyes luminous in the firelight, and in her gaze was a truth they had both carried silently. The pain of the past would never be erased, but together they could write something new, something rooted in healing and trust. The settlement shifted further in its stance as the months turned. Suspicion had not vanished, but it no longer clung so sharp. The boy Nieli had pulled from the well ran up whenever he saw her, tugging at her hand with the innocence of gratitude, and his mother offered small loaves of bread in quiet thanks whenever Elias came to town. The storekeeper no longer narrowed his eyes, but measured flour in silence, while his wife sometimes pressed herbs into Nieli's palm, murmuring that the land gave better when tended by patient hands. Even the men who once spat harsh words seemed to glance away rather than challenge. The pastor often rode out with his Bible tucked under his arm, stopping to share coffee or to stand quietly in their yard, as though the sight of their work together was sermon enough. As spring approached again, Nieli began to walk the edges of the field with Elias, her fingers brushing the soil, her steps steady with purpose. They planned rows of corn, a small patch of beans, even a corner for wildflowers she remembered from her childhood by the river. Elias listened, watching the way her hands gestured, tracing visions into the air. And he realized he had not only opened his gate to her months ago, he had opened his future. The thought did not frighten him. Instead, it filled him with a peace deeper than anything he had known. She was not merely a guest, not merely a survivor. She was home. Together they endured storms of dust, nights of frost, and whispers of doubt, yet each trial seemed to bind them closer, their love not fragile but forged. They learned that healing was not the absence of scars, but the decision to let love flow through them anyway, gentle as water through cracked earth, strong as roots gripping stone. When Elias looked at Nieli now, he did not see the girl by the creek or the stranger at his gate. He saw the woman who had chosen to stay, who had carried her strength into his solitude, who had stood with him against both storm and suspicion. And Nieli, when she looked at him, did not see the weary drifter or the man who almost turned away. She saw the one who had held the rope when she descended into darkness, the one who had faced down riders for her, the one who opened his door when every other door had closed. Their story was no longer about chance survival. It had become a testament to choosing love when fear whispered otherwise, to building roots in soil many believed would never hold, to creating warmth in a world that had too often turned cold. And as the land slowly answered their work with green shoots and new life, so too did their hearts answer one another, each day renewing the quiet vow they had made, not with words, but with presence. So when the evening sky flamed with colors of fire and ash, and they stood together by the corral, Elias's arm brushing hers, Nieli's hand slipping into his, they felt the truth settle deep. What began as survival had become permanence. Their love, tested by dust, by fear, by storms, had grown into something steady, healing, and whole. If this story has stirred something in you, if its warmth or its healing light has touched your heart, I invite you to share that feeling. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Let your voice join the circle. If the love of Elias and Nieli has given you comfort, press like to let it live brighter. And if you wish to walk with me through more stories of love, healing, and resilience, subscribe. It is the simplest way to keep this journey alive, to keep the flame of these tales burning for every soul that seeks light in the dark.